and there's large amounts of underutilized land. So this has also been well documented, and these numbers I have up are from the ALR, from the LSD website. So how much land is in the agricultural land reserve, and then the second number at the bottom is from the total amount of farms according to the 2011 census from Canada. And you can see that the amount of land in the reported to be in the ALR is about double that, which is actually being reported to be actively farmed. And you can see, so there's an issue here with farmland that's not being farmed. So I thought I'd start with a few quotes from prospective farmers from the survey that I did, just to emphasize these issues. The cost of land is by far the #1 issue, and this was repeated by many of the people I've talked to over and over. Another person said, the cost of land and the cost of startup is prohibitive, and I'm not willing to take on that level of debt. So again, just emphasizing the challenges with debt. The last quote, with the extremely high cost of land, hard work, and low income in farming, it's nearly impossible to farm in the BC region. Farming in BC is now for the rich, old, inherited people. Everyone else can only hope to rent, be subordinate to the owner. So I thought that quote just highlights the issues with land rental and not being an ideal means of accessing farmland for everyone. And here we have going towards increased renting in British Columbia. And this is data from the 2011 census again. And we see it starts from 1991 and up to 2011. And we see that there's a decline in the amount of farmland that's owned by farm operators, and an increase in the amount of land that's being rented by farm operators. And so this is driven by the various challenges that farmers, especially the cost of land that farmers face in accessing land. And I think this is, well, renting can be an agreement that works. It is also, I think this is indicative of a problem with access in the province. Another trend I just wanted to mention is quite a bit recently, and again, I have the data from Statistics Canada up here from the last 2011 census. And from 1991 to 2011, there's been a decline in farmers under 35 and an increase in farmers over 55. And so we see a steady trend in an increasing average age of farmers in the province. And that's reflective in the rest of Canada as well as in the US. We see the same trend happening. So I want to make the connection between the farmland access piece and looking at beginning farmers and new farmers. So here, a quote from the American Farmland Trust says that is not farmland without farmers. I have a second quote from a farmer in Richmond who's on a farmland protection panel, and she said the best way to protect our farmland is to farm it. And I think the earlier ones and with this network is the Greenhorns in the United States. And it was formed in 2007 and has members of over 3,000 farmers. Another one from the US is the National Young Farmers Coalition. And it started in 2009 to support young farmers. And then here in BC, we have the BC Young Farmers Forum. There's also, this is a provincial chapter of a federal or a nationwide initiative to support young farmers. And their membership I spoke with someone and they estimated the membership in the range of 500 farmers in BC. Another one from Canada is Farm Start Ontario that has many initiatives to support young farmers and new entrants to agriculture, not just young farmers. And then in BC, again, we have the Young Agrarians, which is relatively new and has really flourished over the past few years. Their networks have dramatically increased. They have events across the province that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So I think this paints a more optimistic picture in terms of there is this growing momentum in farming and accessing land, despite the steps from Statistics Canada. And so I was want to look more into these new farmer networks and who they are and sort of learn more about these emerging young farmers. So I did a bit of background research before I get into my survey. There was a survey in the United States of beginning young farmers, and they identified access to capital and land availability and cost of land as the primary challenges of beginning and young farmers. And then in terms of resources, US survey, as well as some research surveys carried out in Ontario by FarmStart, identified land making, farm transfer support, and resources and tenure options as valued resources by farmers to overcome the land access barriers. And from the US survey, the most needed action was incentives for landowners to sell or rent land. And I think that's also reflected here in BC, that there's a big need for having a mechanism, have land transferred from outgoing farmers to new upcoming farmers who don't have a relationship to the land. And so I wanted to gather some data about access land, what barriers they face, resources they're using, and the type of land access that they're looking for. So I'm going to go through some of the findings from the survey. So the survey was open. It was distributed through various networks, such as the Young Agrarians, Community Futures based out of Prince George, the BCYF. So I had help with networks who are organizations who have networks of young farmers to get responses to this survey. It was open to anyone to respond to, and so this was there was 3 streams, either for current farmers, prospective farmers, which is defined as people who want to become a farm operator and access land in the next 5 years, and then people who don't intend to farm, who are involved with these networks. And so of the respondents, 43% were prospective farmers and 35% were current farmers. So quite a large part of the people who are responding from these networks are people who are either farming or wanting to farm. And of the people who don't intend to farm in the next 5 years, nearly half of them said they were considering farming in the future. So a little bit about the demographics of who this survey data is actually representing. So of the current farmers, 48% of them were under 35. And of the prospective farmers, 72% were under 35. So it is a significant amount of people that are what you classify as young farmers. And then there was also people, the 35 to 44 range had quite a few, both current and prospective farmers. So again, emphasizing that prospective farmers and beginning farmers aren't necessarily young farmers. So when I say beginning and young farmers, it includes, by beginning, I've used the definition of farming for less than 10 years, and young is under 35. So beginning and young farmer meets one of those. So you don't need to be young to be a beginning farmer. Important to recognize. And then just a little bit about, again, some more demographics. So I want to point out, so I have a chart up here with the ethnicity of the respondents, and a large proportion identified as being Caucasian, white, or European, and Canadian. And I just want to point out that the demographics that we have here is representative of the cultural diversity present in BC's agricultural population. Nearly 20% of farmers in BC were born outside of Canada, and also the 70% of all respondents are male. So again, not representative of the gender distribution in the agricultural sector. So just to point out that the differences in who's represented here. And so a little bit about the question of who will be farming the land. So we have 82% of the prospective farmers and 67% of the beginning and young farmers were from non-farming backgrounds. So there's this trend towards farmers who come from a non-farming family or non-farming background and want to get into farming. And this has also been reflected in the other surveys that the background research I did, both in Canada and the US. And this is a big piece in the Farmland Access research, because these farmers aren't going to be inheriting land or don't have family lands to get started on. So the land access picture has a different dynamic for farmers coming from non-farm backgrounds compared to intergenerational farmers. And it seems like there's a rise in these non-farming background farmers. There's also, it seems to be, there's a large percentage of people coming from urban areas who want to get into farming. 38% of the prospective farmers.
Angelique, could you please mute your microphone? Angelique Wood, thank you.
And
so is Angelique Wood online?
We might be able to mute just anything coming in. Yeah.
Yeah, we're getting quite a bit of feedback from her.
Yeah. Just a couple other points about who they farmland. So most of the people had higher education. There was a lot of second career farmers, and most of the respondents had some sort of informal agricultural training or work experience already. And so another question we had was where prospective farmers want to farm. So I have a map up here with, and you see there's a predominant farm on the Vancouver Island and South Coast and the Lower Mainland, as well as a significant chunk in the Kootenays and the Thompson-Okanagan region, with lesser numbers of people wanting to farm in the more northern parts of the province. And this is again, so where are current Canadian young farmers farming? And again, sort of same trends with more farmers in the southern part of the province. And going back to the prospective farmer locations, I just wanted to compare this with where there is agricultural land. And so we have here the hectares of ALR land in different regions. And you can see that we have huge amounts of agricultural land in the north, especially in the Peace River and the Caribou region. And I think it's worthwhile to note that where people want to farm isn't necessarily where the land is. So a few questions about practices on the land. Many of farmers were interested in small agriculture under 20 acres of land. And most of 76% of the farmers who responded were currently farming less than 20 acres. Environmental stewardship was very important, as well as organic practices, though not necessarily certification. And there's definitely a large diversity of production and income streams that were represented. So I asked people to rate barriers, the significance of various barriers to entry into agriculture, as well as resources. And so it was rated on a 1 to 7 scale, from extremely significant to not significant at all. And so I've made the list here of the ones that were either extremely or very significant, just to point out the ones that are perceived to be the most significant barriers. And I just want to highlight some of the ones around land. So we see the top two, and this is reflected with the US survey that I mentioned earlier, the top two barriers are cost of land and lack of capital for prospective farmers. And then also, I wanted to point out, so I asked whether it was the appropriate type of farmland that is a barrier, or the current availability, or the actual lack of farmland. And you can see here that the lack of farmland is less of a barrier than the actual availability of land, or the appropriate availability of the appropriate type of farmland. And so again, most valued resources, the same thing as 1 to 7 scale. And so for prospective farmers, the top resource was alternative financing. And we also see loan programs for beginning young farmers was highly valued. And this matches well with the top barriers of what people prospective farmers need. Also interesting that there's a big trend towards, or an interest in these alternative financing mechanisms, as opposed to the traditional loan mechanisms. And then again, pointing out the ones that have to do with land. So farmland protection programs were highly valued by prospective farmers, as well as the current farmers. Land linking programs, and for those of you who aren't familiar, land linking programs are programs where landholders who have land that they aren't farming are linked with people who are looking for land, so sort of a matching system. Then land access resources, so that can be various resources like how to draft an access agreement or a lease, and how to approach landholders. And then again, and farm transfer and succession planning programs are also valued. I think it's interesting to point out that with valued resources, in terms of the training, it's the hands-on training in the farmer to mentoring program that is valued. That was clear in both the prospective and the current farmers. I also want to point out recognizing some differing challenges across demographics and geographic location. Because as I said, in terms of the demographics, a lot of these farmers are coming from non-farm backgrounds. So those farmers from farm backgrounds would likely have different primary concerns. It might not be farmland access. So with multi-generational young farmers, I think successional challenges and growing the business on a limited land base that you already have access to are bigger challenges than the actual potentially accessing new land. So just to acknowledge that there are differences amongst different demographics of beginning farmers, as well as the geographic location. So the land availability may not be as big a challenge in the more northern parts of the province as it is in the southern parts of the province. And there's different challenges such as the economics of the northern region and declining populations that are challenged more so than that aren't challenged in the lower mainland. So just to point out those differences exist. So I was going to transition back into the alternative tenure piece here. And to do that, I want to sort of connect these four pieces of the puzzle. That we're not just conserving or protecting farmland, it's farmland and the farmers. So I sort of see it as this interconnected circle of we need to protect the agricultural land base, support new and beginning farmers accessing that land base, details the land availability and access to that land, and then the last piece is the actual viability on the land. So we can't not just getting the people on the land. Once people have access to land, they actually need to be able to make a viable livelihood on the land if they're to continue farming and our agricultural land bases to continue to remain agricultural. And so there's all these components, and I'm focusing in on the land access piece and the new and beginning young farmers. So transitioning into the community farms and alternative land access piece. Hannah mentioned her work with the Community Farms program. And again, this is a program that began in 2006 as a collaboration between the Land Conservancy of BC and Farm Folk City Folk. And the definition that was developed of a community farm by the Community Farms Network is a community farm is a multifunctional farm where the land is held in trust for community rather than owned privately. The community group or cooperative governs the land use agreements, and agricultural uses of the land are shared by a community of farmers. So it's quite a specific definition, and there aren't a lot of farms that necessarily fit into that particular definition. It's something to strive towards for community farms. And so we sort of broadened the picture and looking more at shared farming on shared land. So that really sort of opens it up to a wider diversity of alternative ways, or what might be classified as sort of a community of farmers sharing and farming together on land, and how that's happening. And then also using the word alternative farmland tenure or alternative access, again, looking at models other than the traditional private ownership and individual family farm enterprises, and what those are and how people are using them and why they're using them. And so we've developed a sort of topology of alternative farmland access, and this started from the initial research Hannah did documenting about 20 farms in 2009. And I've built off of this with the documentation of the new farms that we've been interviewing and looking at currently. So I've sort of separated into three different pieces, and that's the land ownership, so who actually owns the land, land access, so how farmers are getting on the land and who's getting on the land, and then the management or operating arrangements once people are on the land. So then there's a whole diversity within these three categories, and you match them up in all different ways. So there's a huge diversity of models out there, and they all employ sort of different parts of this list mashed up in different ways. So it's hard to sort of classify into specific categories. So I sort of like this is sort of like a choose your own adventure. If you pick one from each list, you get a model that's out there. And so just to, I think for some of you who can't see the slide, so for instance, land ownership could be something like a land trust or public land. Land access is various mechanisms like short-term leases, ownership, informal, crop share, and then the management can be a formal cooperative, an informal cooperative, private enterprise, so various combinations. And just to clarify what these are, I'm going to go over some examples. So starting here with land ownership that is a cooperative. So this sort of is the initial community farm definition that Hannah was looking at and that I read out. So the land is owned, where the land is owned cooperatively, then it's accessed by farmers through a long-term lease. And I have two examples. So one of them is Horse Lake Farm near 100 Mile House. And in this case, the long-term lease is to a workers' cooperative. There's actually two separate legal cooperatives in this case. So one cooperative owns the land, and then there's the farming cooperative that has a lease to farm that land. And then the second case, Glen Valley in Abbotsford. In this case, again, it's a land cooperative, long-term lease, but instead of to a cooperative of farmers, it's a long-term lease to individual farm enterprises. So these are nice examples where you can have cooperatively held land, both accessed by farmers farming together cooperatively or independent businesses who are sharing land and resources but have independent farm businesses. So examples of public lands, so land held by the government. And I have a few different examples with different access and management models. So one of them is the Richmond Sharing Farm, as well as the Richmond Incubator Farm, those are two different pieces of public land held in Richmond. So the Richmond Sharing Farm is governed by a nonprofit society, and the Incubator Farm has been, it was also managed by a nonprofit society, but it's been handed over to the University of Kwantlen to run educational programs. And so in these cases, the access, so for the Incubator Farm, we'd have short-term leases to the incubator farmers. For people who aren't familiar with Incubator Farm, it's where farmers who are starting out are able to access land for a limited period of time to get started, and then they would move on. So 2 to 3 to 5 years. And the Sharing Farm is run by a nonprofit society, and they have a hired farm operator, a manager, as well as various educational programs and people who volunteer and work on the land. So another example from Saanich is Halliburton Farm. It's public land, and it's managed by a nonprofit society. Then it's accessed by individual farmers who hold short-term leases. So the maximum is the leases are 5 years. So again, it's sort of a starting out model, so farmers can have access to land for 5 years to build a business and their knowledge on the land. And another example is the farm also in Saanich, in central Saanich. And so again, public land, and in this case, it's been managed by the Farmland Trust Society, and they're a nonprofit society again. And so this was a relatively new agreement between the nonprofit society and the city. So when I had talked to them, they hadn't developed exactly how the land was going to be accessed by the farmers. So another model is where the land is actually owned by the nonprofit society. So an example of this is Sendon, the Agriculture and Resource Center in Hazelton, BC. It's Smithers. And so this is an example where a nonprofit society purchased farmland. So it's owned by the society, and it's accessed by society members and the participants of programs led by the nonprofit society. And in this case, it's they do job training and skills training, land-based on the agricultural land. Another example on Vancouver Island in Duncan is Glenora Farm. So again, it's owned by the nonprofit society, managed by a nonprofit society, and in this case, they provide a place to live and work for people with developmental disabilities. And so people on the land are society members and program participants, and they also have a hired farm manager, but the people living there contribute to the farming as well. And then moving on to land trusts. So land trusts are also a nonprofit society, but with a specific focus on holding land or holding covenants on land. And so an example of this is Majona Farm in Saanich, where the land is held by a nonprofit society and is accessed through a long-term lease to a farm operator. In the case of Majona, it's an individual farm enterprise. And then the second example is Keating Farm, also on Vancouver Island. And this is an interesting example because the Keating Farm is currently up for sale, or I'm not sure if it's been sold or not, but this is a recent news article that the Keating Farm can be sold as land conservancy grapples with debt. So I just wanted to, as we're talking about land trust, talk about the Land Conservancy of BC. And so they have major debt and have had their assets frozen by the CRA, and are working to overcome that. And so this is problematic and raises a lot of questions about how land trusts work and whether it's actually an effective strategy for holding land over in perpetuity as they're supposed to, especially with the example of Keating Farm being up for sale. I'm going to talk a little bit more about farmland trust later, but just for the Keating example, in this example, the land was held by a land trust and it was leased to a cooperative, and a big problem that was faced was the land was mortgage on the land, so they weren't able to finance the land up front, and this mortgage, they tried to sell shares to by the cooperative, to create the cooperative, and to finance the land, but they didn't sell enough shares, and so the cooperative ended up holding debt, and this prevented the cooperative from successfully moving forward and establishing what could have been on that land. And so that, I think that's a learning lesson. It's not, a cooperative shouldn't be forming cooperatives in which members enter and have debt, and also that having going to a land trust, not taking out mortgages on more land that you can pay. And covenants are one way that I'll mention a little bit, but of doing that without having to actually acquire the land and pay the cost of the land and hold debt and mortgage. And so the last example here is where the land is owned privately. And then there's, again, various access and management mechanisms. And so one example here from the Slocan Valley. So it's a private landholder. It's being formally accessed by a group of farmers. So there's various families living on the land, but they're not formally a cooperative, and they don't have a formal arrangement. So it's sort of, but they did mention that they are interested in becoming more formalized. But this is an example of a private land and an informal access arrangement. Another example is Green City Acres in Kelowna. And this is a model where, again, it's mostly informal or handshake agreements or memorandums of understanding in which the farmers are accessing often residential lands to farm it. And so there's many examples of this in Vancouver and many other places in the province. Kelowna and Elton. Here's another example from Rossland. Gravity Farm and access various properties on handshake agreements. And so the land is privately held, and this enables farmers to access without having to invest. But there's lots of challenges that involve with these types of agreements. Landholders can pull out at any time. That might not be fair. So I'm just going to reiterate some of what the motivations and benefits for these types of agreements are. A big one is the shared cost of land. Access being a means of access. Shared resources. And this is a really big one. Many people who are in shared land access agreements, not just land,
Dennis?
irrigation. So it really reduces.
It's really hard to hear you. There's a whole other.
And again, shared knowledge and mentoring is a really big, a really great importance to those using these models. The ability to farm with other people as you're starting up is a huge asset to beginning farmers and new farmers. And some of these models, like the land trusts or the cooperatives, are means of holding farmland and protecting farmland by the community. And another one is non-family intergenerational farming, and that relates back to the mentoring. But for young people who don't have farm families, entering into these community farms is appealing, in that you can have intergenerational relationships with farmers on the land. And then the potential for not having debt. So debt is carrying debt as a young farmer can be very, very challenging. And so many people want to avoid that, and that's I think a big driver of why people are using these agreements. And then many of these farms have mandates beyond just production. And so you see an integration of agriculture and other social mandates, both on the farm and off the farm. And so there's benefits beyond the production on the farm itself. But there's come with challenges, and again, there's many challenges that I've heard from the people I've spoken with, and just to highlight a few here. Some of these, like the formal cooperatives, there's complex legal, financial, and governance arrangements, and this can be a lot for people who don't have the knowledge to enter into these agreements, and it can be very time-consuming. And financing. So in some cases, it doesn't actually address the issue of financing the land acquisition, like in the case of Keating Farm I mentioned. So it was an alternative mechanism. There was a co-op in place, but it still didn't overcome the barrier of the cost of that land and being able to hold the cost of that land. And so this is still a big issue, is how, even with these shared land access models and people want to hold land together, protect land, how can we actually finance the acquisition of that land? And personal relationships between farmers and between the farmers on the land and between farmers and landholders is also one of the primary challenge I've heard from people using these models, whether it's a formal co-op and it's the dynamics within the co-op, or it's these informal agreements and the dynamics between the landholder and the farmer with the informal agreement. That it's both time consuming, energy consuming, and that this is it requires a lot of work. And again, along with that, the complicated decision making. So especially if you have a board, if you're working with a nonprofit society or with a co-op, so it's just an added on expenditure of your time as a farmer. And so some farmers, this isn't necessarily what they want to spend their time doing. And so it's just important to recognize that being involved with a structure like this involves both the knowledge and understanding of how they operate and your time to be involved with these decision making processes. Then housing and zoning regulations are barriers to some of the shared access models. And then balancing privacy and independence on the farm. So many farms, so there's this tension between wanting to access land and use these and farm together with people in community and cooperative, but also being able to balance your privacy and your independence as a farmer. Many people get into farming because they want to be their own managers and bosses. And so if you enter into a cooperative agreement, that, it's something that you need to consider, and we need to recognize that these models aren't for everyone. And some of these alternative models do allow for sort of a cooperative land holding, for instance, but then the independence as the farm operator. And so I think there's a need for a whole diversity of models that meet the needs of people who want to be independent farm businesses. And so I can jump back to the survey that I did. And so one of the questions I want to look at as we research these alternative models was, well, what type of land access do prospective farmers actually want? People want to enter into these arrangements that we're looking at, these alternative models. And so prospective farmers, what their top 3 land access arrangements were, what their ideal arrangement would be. And private ownership was the #1 choice. The second choice being cooperative ownership out of a range of agreements, including short and long-term leases, crop share, and hired operator, and some others. So private ownership was the first choice. And then for both prospective farmers and the beginning and young current farmers, for those who were interested in having a lease or who currently had a lease for their farming, I asked if they hoped to own land in the future. And 100% of prospective farmers said yes, they hope to own land in the future. And 91% of beginning and young farmers who don't currently own land hope to own land in the future. So, and I didn't clarify whether that was individual or cooperative ownership. It was just owning land through some mechanism. And also similar questions about operating arrangements. And for both prospective and current farmers, the individual or family farm was the most favored operating arrangement. So I think this is important to note in terms of what it is that people want as we are looking at these alternative models that we're trying to support or advance, and ensuring that we're matching what people want and need to what we're developing. And so following the question on what ideal arrangements farmers wanted, I asked farmers to rate their willingness to engage in alternative land access models if they had the opportunity. And so there is, despite wanting to own their own farmland, there is a willingness to engage in these different models. And so again, I used a ranking system. And so for those who can see the slide, at the top of my list, I have the arrangements that have the highest level of willingness, and at the bottom there's a low level of willingness to engage in. And so what I noticed here is, and for those on the phone, so some of the examples at the top, the high level of willingness are farm transfer arrangement with a retiring farmer, cooperative ownership of farmers, lease from an agricultural land trust, or cooperative ownership. So those were the top where there was the most willingness. The least willingness were ones such as crop share, access from potential landowners, hired farm operator. And so what you see is that where there's a high level of willingness are the agreements that have a high level of tenure security. Where there's a low level of willingness is those with low level of security, so the unstable relationships. And so this reflects, again, that farmers want long-term security on the land, even if they're using these alternative mechanisms. And again, same thing with the attitudes towards operating arrangements. I have them rate their willingness to engage in different types of arrangements. We're focusing on what would be sort of different shared arrangements. And so as I mentioned, so individual or family farm is at the top of the list in terms of willingness. Are hired farm operator, informal cooperatives, and informal partnerships, whereas formal cooperatives and formal partnerships had a high level of willingness. So again, you just see there's an element of want stability in the operating arrangements as well. So informal operating arrangements can work for people, but it seems that there's a tendency towards wanting a more formalized and stable arrangement on the land that you're accessing. And so, in many of the farmers that I've spoken with, or the events that we've attended, you hear over and over farmers, especially sort of these young farmers starting out, that they don't think they're ever going to be able to access land. That ownership isn't even an option anymore. And so I think it's really interesting to note this sentiment that farmers, starting out farmers have, but then the desire to have ownership in these stable models. So when I say reducing the gap between desire and reality, so understanding what farmers' realities are and why they're entering into these agreements, but then what their actual desires are for farming. So what farmers want versus what they're willing to accept and perceive as realistic. I think one young farmer that I spoke with recently, she was discussed her leasing situation, and she was fully aware that it wasn't ideal when she entered into it. She was